My connection to Anderson Island started in 1970. Let me think here. Been here for 28 years, so whatever that subtracted from 2012, it's a little fuzzy about a lot of things. I know why I came here. My wife was having some medical problems, and I wanted to get her away from the hustle and bustle of Seattle. She was suffering from depression, and we wanted to kind of get a little bit more rural feel into our lives, and so we looked for a year from Everett to Tacoma, looking for a house that would suit us and an atmosphere that would suit us. And I had known Dick Owens for some time, and he lived here, still does. And so after looking every place, it seemed like, I asked Dick about what he knew about this location and what it was like, and he had a house that he owned but didn't live in full time here on the island. He does live in it now full time, but at the time he didn't. So Carolyn and I came out and looked. He said, "I know a house that would be a perfect timeshare." Well, it belonged to Bill Kolachek, and it was down at the end of Coal Point Drive. And we looked at it and fell in love with it because of the view. It was right on the water. I think we need to stop for a second and let this. So Carolyn and I moved to Coal Point, and we had wonderful neighbors. The people on Anderson Island are the best. My neighbor on one side was Gene Rollinson, who had bought the house next door, and my neighbor on the opposite side is Chuck Granoski. He's an attorney in town. We hit it off immediately, have been friends for years. And as a matter of fact, Gene came down to the luncheon that was put on by the Anderson Island Association. And I hadn't seen her for a couple of years, so it was nice to see her again. Anyway, association with the military was I joined the National Guard when I was 15 years old, lied about my age with a straight face, and eventually went to work full-time from the National Guard and corrected the lies that I told. They were not lies, they were just an attempt to join the National Guard at an age that was not appropriate. And my experiences with the National Guard, I think I joined in 1953. And my experience with the National Guard helped me to grow up. And as a 15-year-old, no driver's license, I found myself able to become more mature and made friends with men that were much older than I was. I loved it. I loved the experience. The military is the greatest thing in my, as I recall, the men that I associated with were also interested in what the military had to offer. And so we got along good. It was like camping. We'd go out to Fort Lewis and find a spot that we could provide training. I joined an artillery unit, and in those days they loved to reorganize the National Guard, and they did that. It seemed like every 2 years. And so I started out as an artilleryman, and then they switched it over to straight leg infantry, not mechanized, which is what that means. And then they made us mechanized, and they gave us all this equipment. Of course, we had to then go to Yakima and train in the desert on how to drive tanks or mechanized equipment that was in direct support of infantry. We had eventually became the equipment that we had were armored personnel carriers of different kinds, and just about everybody had to be trained on how to drive one of those creations. Yeah, it was fun. It was fun driving it. Our biggest problem was that the maintenance on it, which was first echelon, which was the driver. He became the owner, and he had to maintain the piece of equipment or organize the element that he was in to maintain it. And it was very difficult. We didn't do a very good job in that aspect. And then I decided I wanted to be employed full-time. And so I made myself available, and they said, we need somebody who can supervise the recruiters. And so that's what I became. I was the Sergeant Major of recruiting for the state of Washington. And the element was all made up of, the recruiting element were made up of full-time personnel that did other things for the National Guard. Like there was mechanics out of the shops because they could get more pay. They get paid commensurate with their grade, not as a technician, for example. And it also boosted their military rank. I ended up hiring most of the recruiters that became part of the National Guard's recruiting element. As a Sergeant Major, I had a lot of experience doing things other than being a Sergeant Major. So as a result, I grew as well as the organization. We were competing with other states, and they 6th Army is a element where is an organization of states. Can be from Washington, Oregon, Idaho, trying to think of the other states that were involved. Wyoming, and some other state. I can't recall the names of all of them now. But we competed against each other, and the summertime was the most difficult time to recruit. So we would have a competition in the summertime of which state could do the best job of recruiting. And we gave ourselves missions to recruit from the high schools. We had it broken down so that we were searching for the element that would be the best fit for the National Guard. And so, and we were very successful. The state of Washington probably had the best recruiting program, not because of me, but because of the recruiters. I was involved because I wanted them to be the best, and we trained very diligently to accomplish that task. After I'd been in and had been a Sergeant Major for a while, they wanted me to go to the Sergeant Major Academy because we didn't have anybody in the state that was a graduate of that organization. And so I packed up my wife and my dog and jumped in the car and drove to El Paso, Texas. And we got there about 3 weeks before my schooling started. And so we went out and lived on the economy in a motel. And we'd walk the dog every day, and it was really a very interesting place, El Paso. It was high desert, like Yakima. People down there did not like to see us walking a black lab on the street because they were afraid of dogs. And I see people that were a couple of blocks ahead of us walking toward us, across the street to avoid us. That was their call. But then we get back to the motel and the maids would be standing out in front of our room. Hey, you're standing out in front of our room because they're afraid to go in. If we didn't take the dog with us, they would have cleaned our room. So it didn't take us long to figure that out, and we wanted our room clean, obviously. So we managed to take her with us, and she did good. The Sergeant Major's Academy was another life experience for me. I was the senior man at the academy, senior student by date of rank. And when I processed in, they had already found who they thought was the senior man, and he was the sergeant major from, let's see, where was he from? Oh, Indiana. Well, when they were going through looking at records, they found his date of rank, and they stopped there. They said, there isn't anybody going to have a earlier date of rank than this guy. And so when I walked in to sign up for my classes and find out what they were, where I had to be. Excuse me.
Hi there.
Hi. Hi, Ron.
Hi. I'm sorry, did I interrupt something?
No, I'm being interviewed. American Legion, it's, you didn't hurt anything. So, anyway, the guy that was standing behind the counter said an expletive that indicated to me that he said, oh no, we really screwed up here. And I said, it's not a problem. I'll be class leader of every class that I'm in. I don't have a problem with that. I really don't want to be the class president. I want the training that isn't interrupted by other activities. So they agreed with me, and it worked out fine. Completed the training. One of the interesting things was that the National Guard didn't really do PT. So as a result, I had to do PT and I had to do it cold turkey, you know. Well, when I failed my first PT test, they put me in remedial PT and I had to go every other day to the gymnasium and do PT. Now, I'm a basketball player. That was my favorite sport. So after doing PT, practicing all the push-ups, sit-ups, running, my running was on the basketball court. So I played basketball after I got through training. The PT test was my graduation from the academy because I passed it. And it was not easy. I had to do, and I was an older man. I was not young. Most of the guys that were down there were probably in their late 20s, early 30s. I was in my 50s. And so my experience with the PT test at that age, it was a real win when I passed that PT test. You know, I got my time. The last thing that we did was the run, 2-mile run. And when I got my time, as I passed the finish line, they were calling out times. I said, I just graduated. Because not only did they have all the tests that you had to pass from the training standpoint, but also the PT test. So physical training was a big part of my life. And I was always overweight. But by whatever test that they did, they had pinch tests where they measured the fat in your body. That's how I got by. I was heavy, but I was not fat. And so as a result, I didn't have a problem with being weighed, is accomplishing the requirements of the test. I found difficult. But I trained up for it and managed to succeed. And then I got the job of putting together the yearbook for our class, class 25. My wife was a regional editor for TV Guide. She was a tremendous help because she knew how to put a book together. We ended up doing that. It was the last thing I had to do there. And I've got a copy of the book, which was interesting in that probably we had a class of 250, and I would guess about 50 of them had a top secret clearance and could not say what they did in the Army because they were fellows that went to South America and measured the metal, for example, that the Soviet tanks were made of. They wanted to know what we were dealing with if we had to go to war. And that's what these guys did. They were spies, if you will. And so we couldn't take their picture. All we could say is that this guy was in this class. And there was about 50 of them. No pictures, just names. It was very interesting. I had no idea that we had that kind of a relationship with people like that. I joined the Army. That was my preference, actually, Army National Guard. After some time as a guardsman, as a matter of fact, I was in almost 20 years before I went on active duty. And I went on active duty as a Sergeant Major E9. So it didn't hurt for money. That was the highest rank you could attain for an enlisted man. And I never made Command Sergeant Major because that requires you to be in charge of a battalion or an organization that is either divisional, a brigade. The Command Sergeant Major has a different requirement than Staff Sergeant Major, and I've always been a Staff Sergeant Major, and I was happy with that. I did compete with others to become a Command Sergeant Major, but the battalion commanders didn't want a recruiter, which was basically what I was doing for the majority of my time. So, after being a recruiter for many years, full time, I went to the State Sergeant Major, who's in charge of all of the Sergeant Majors, and said, I need a change of venue here. I love this job, but somebody else needs to do it for a while. And I said I would be happy to take over schools, which was my next step in the evolution of my career. I went to work for the operations side of the organization and arranged for soldiers, after they completed their basic training, advanced individual training, I would send them to the school for their MOS. Like all medical training is given at Fort Sam Houston, Texas. And so their MOSs were like being nurses. None of them were going to be a doctor, but they were going to operate equipment. If you ever had anything done to you at Madigan, those are all the MOSs that are in the medical field. And I sent them to school for their MOSs, range transportation, training, and for them to get down and back. Very interesting job. Most of my duty was done at Camp Murray, which is the headquarters for the Washington National Guard. And had a lot of help. The Adjutant General is there, and also the United States Property and Fiscal Officer. They handle the money. That's what they do. And I had about $1 million budget, and I had to spend that in the appropriate places. I didn't want to go to jail, so I was very careful, very observant of what happened to money that I was accountable for. And so training takes a lot of dollars, and so I had a lot of dollars to deal with. I met a lot of guys that had a special award, the Congressional Medal of Honor, which is now just the Medal of Honor, not Congress. Fell off to the side, they don't call it that anymore. I met a number of those because they came to the academy where I was going to school, and they came to the state headquarters where I was operating as a employee of the state. And what's really surprised me is the youth, how young most of them were. Got a guy that's saluted by generals who's maybe 30 years old because he got the Medal of Honor. And he did it generally in combat. So I was very impressed with them. My wife Carolyn, who is now deceased, was my biggest hero. She is educated, graduated Washington State University. She worked for TV Guide she worked her way up from a book editor to the editor for all of the books that were printed here they were printed in Seattle, one of the big print shops. And I think she had seven books she was responsible for. And she was my best friend, and she got breast cancer, and she defeated it. They said she was cancer-free. And then we suddenly found out when she was going into the hospital in Olympia that she had leukemia. The cancer that she had in her breast migrated to her blood making bones. And after we found out, she didn't last very long after that. About 2 months.
Wow.
So her death was a big surprise to me and hurt me deeply. Because we would have, our problem most often would argue about who was going to go first. And I said, it's me. I'm 10 years older than you. And so I'm going to go first. And she did. But we did spend a lot of years together. We were nearly 40 years in our marriage. Not quite, 39. And we lived on the island down on Coal Point for most of those years. Just a wonderful woman.